The pattern of trade is changing a lot because of the tariffs. But the tariffs have had precious little impact. In fact, none at all, I would say. Almost all the private developers or the major private developers in China nowadays are either bankrupt or not in very good financial situation. And it's not over yet because there's still a lot of excess supply, possibly up to 3 to 5 years worth of unsold apartments and houses.
China's trade surplus has now surpassed $8 trillion, a sign it's successfully weathering the tariff war with the US. But at home, weaknesses in key sectors like housing are becoming apparent. To unpack the complicated economic landscape, I'm joined now by economist and author George Magnus. George, thank you so much for speaking to us again. Let's look at trade first. The November figures show that China's overall exports do not seem to be suffering as a result of the tariff dispute with the US. Quite the opposite, in fact. And I'm trying to understand the dynamic behind this. Has Beijing managed to find a whole lot of new buyers very quickly? Or has the surplus grown because China is importing less? Or is there something else entirely going on?
Well, there are at least a couple of things going on here. One is obviously the impact of the tariffs, which the United States has levied on China, and to some degree, kind of vice versa. It is certainly having a pronounced effect on the pattern of trade between the United States and China, and between China and other countries. So, for example, Chinese exports to America are down by about a fifth, roughly. But of course, exports to other countries, which are acting as transshipment points or trade diversion points, are booming. So the pattern of trade is changing a lot because of the tariffs. But the tariffs have had precious little impact, in fact, none at all, I would say, on the overall surplus that China is running with the rest of the world and the overall deficit, for example, that the Americans are running with the rest of the world. And you wouldn't expect the tariffs to have that kind of impact at all. So these surpluses and deficits, generally speaking, are basically, they come from domestic imbalances between savings and investment. So they're determined at home, not abroad. And in China's case in particular, it is because the country is pursuing a very mercantilist kind of trade policy where they want the rest of the world to be dependent on them, but they don't want to be dependent themselves on the rest of the world. So even though China imports a lot of stuff, right, fuel, semiconductors, agricultural products, metals, resources, and so on, it doesn't import a lot of manufactures. And the whole idea of China's trade policy manifests itself in booming exports, but very, very little growth in imports. And that's the problem for the rest of the world, including developed and emerging countries.
So it's a problem for the rest of the world. But I'm wondering, is this desire for self-reliance a problem for China as well?
It can be. The whole purpose of trade, right, is you want to export what you're particularly good at. It's what we call comparative advantage, so that you can import stuff from other people, other countries that they're particularly good at. So by pursuing policies of self-reliance and cleansing of supply chains and all of the kind of geopolitical stuff that's entered into the trade space, it's not a particularly efficient way of organizing your international commerce and transactions. And of course, it could lead to the kind of problems that we see manifest in China, for example, where lots and lots of things are being produced almost without regard for price or profit or efficiency. And I think that's also part of the problem.
Is there anything in particular that China is missing out on by pursuing this strategy in terms of imports from other countries?
Well, I would say yes. There's been quite a lot of discussion really about recently, I would say in particular, about whether China can kind of snub its nose at the rest of the world and Europe in particular by saying, well, we don't really need anything that you've got, so we don't really need to import it. That, I think, is a misnomer, actually. I don't think that's right. If Chinese households and Chinese citizens had the income and the wherewithal and the confidence to be able to spend money more with more gusto, I think they would happily import products from Europe and the rest of the world, including manufacturers. And I think that it's not right to say that there's nothing that the rest of the world produces that China doesn't want, but it is certainly true to say that China's, inability to import lots of things is contingent really on the well-being of Chinese consumers, which is not all of that great at the moment.
That's very interesting. And I want to talk more about private consumption in a few moments. But first of all, against the backdrop of all this geopolitical tension, we also recently got a glimpse of the government's next 5-year plan, which appears to be focusing on boosting industrial strength. Now, you've written that this will widen a rift within China between the strong tech sector, which has world-class brands, and the rest of the economy, which operates very differently. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, of course. A lot of this is currently, we're kind of grappling in the dark a little bit. Quite recently in October, we had a very important meeting, so-called Fourth Plenum of the Chinese Communist Party, which was hearing and opining really and summarizing the key outlines of the 15th five-year plan, which will be unveiled in full in spring of 2026 at the National People's Congress. And we might get a little bit of a hint about what's in store for 2026 in the next few days when another important meeting called the Central Economic Work Conference takes place. But what I'm kind of reading between the lines at this juncture is that the emphasis, China's going to place emphasis on two very important things. One is a persistence with the industrial policy that it's pursuing on a scale that is unprecedented in terms of size of GDP. It's possibly more than anybody except the Russians and the Ukrainians are spending on defense. And the other, by recognition, the government or the leadership certainly knows that it has to do more to encourage greater domestic demand and greater consumption. How they square this circle is really complicated and really difficult to predict because the policies that help one of these strategies, in other words, industrial policy, damage the fight to promote consumption and vice versa. So, for example, if you just take one or two examples, a lot of the subsidies and the grants and the special favors that are granted to Chinese industries to produce more and to manufacture more electric vehicles or more pharmaceuticals or whatever. I mean, a lot of this money could go to supporting consumption, but isn't. Another example would be the exchange rate, the renminbi, which is probably quite cheap, quite undervalued at this particular point. And the government could allow that to increase in value significantly. That would obviously act to spur imports into China because it would make foreign goods cheaper for Chinese consumers. But of course, if you allow the exchange rate to appreciate a lot, that's going to damage the exports, which is what they're very keen to promote. So it's kind of on the one hand, on the other. There are some things that you could probably do in China to help both industrial policy and consumption, but many things basically are conflicted.
And what exactly is the source of that conflict? If you use the example of investing a lot in a sector like electric vehicles, why does that hamper the aim to boost private consumption?
Well, if you spend, for example, a lot of, with regard to electric vehicles, it's probably the case now that a lot of the subsidies have been unwound because of the big sort of boom in subsidies to electric vehicles is a few years behind us, although it's just kind of moved on to other sectors. But the more resource you allocate to the promotion of key industries and to exports, you basically have a whole kind of infrastructure of policy which is being geared towards helping industries, firms, large companies, national champions. And those resources could be used to spur household consumption through regulatory changes, tax cuts, income growth, social security, etc., etc. So that's the kind of conflict. Or governments are often facing this kind of conflict or incompatibility between policies that kind of take with one hand but give with the other, and vice versa.
Okay, interesting. Now, if we look at a few sectors individually, starting with housing, a lot of the trouble with Chinese real estate first became apparent, at least to the general public, in around 2020 when the government took action to prevent a bubble from forming. Why did it fear things were getting so out of control in the first place? And how would you assess the measures it took in response?
Well, when they introduced the so-called three red lines, which were quite strict limitations on the leverage and the liabilities which were permitted for China's real estate developers, this just didn't happen out of the blue. This happened 20 years into a housing boom in which as we know from many, many other countries' experiences in the past. These things basically are very, very powerful, very, very feel good. When the boom is going on, everybody is optimistic. Banks are lending money hand over fist based on the collateral of property or land. People commit to expenditure patterns, assuming that house prices will continue to rise as they have done, for the last 10 years, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we all know what this story looks like. The trouble is that when the party ends and the whole cycle goes into reverse, it happens first a little bit slowly, but then very, very suddenly, and the consequences can be very, very serious and last quite a long time. Why did the government do this? I think the government did this in 2020 because they were worried about the financial instability risks that were building in the banking system and in the developers who were kind of overextended. Almost all the private developers or the major private developers in China nowadays are either bankrupt or are not in very good financial situation, such that state funded or state-owned developers are basically taking on more and more of the role of managing China's housing market. Should they have done it? Well, there's never a good time to do it, except at the beginning when the pain may be that much less. So I think, one probably has to conclude that it was inevitable that it was going to have to be done. They chose to do it in 2020, and the consequences have been as bad as anybody might have expected them to be. And it's not over yet because there's still a lot of excess supply, possibly up to 3 to 5 years worth of unsold apartments and houses, mostly in the kind of cities that most people don't really know. We all know about Beijing and Shanghai and Shenzhen and so on. But it's in the smaller cities there most of the excess supply is. And it'll take a very, very long time for that to clear, especially because the cohorts of first-time buyers, so the 25 to 35-year-olds, is now declining in line with kind of population decline.
Yeah, and of course, this huge rise in property prices also fueled household debt in China. Now, I know this is an issue that many other countries have as well, especially the United States, for example. How does the situation in China compare internationally when it comes to this issue?
It's pretty bad. The worst countries, the worst housing experiences that I think outside of China that we've seen, certainly amongst major countries, probably were in Spain and in Ireland in the 2000s. And of course, we all know that all, ended in tears after the Lehman crisis in 2008. And it's been a very, very long kind of process of adaptation and change and adjustment and lots of consequences of, quantitative easing and all sorts of weird and wonderful monetary policies that we've had experience of. In China, the situation is not dissimilar, but it's much more controlled. No banks are going to go bust. No major banks are going to go bust in China, as they did in our own experience in 2008-9. And the degree to which the government allows property prices to fall, in other words, for the market to clear, is limited because they don't want to encourage excessive amount of instability. They certainly don't want to compromise the already slightly fractious situation of several medium-sized banks, for example, to which obviously the big banks, the big six banks, have lines of credit or funding obligations and liabilities and so on. So the government craves a kind of stability in the financial system for reasons that we can understand. But if you don't allow prices to clear properly in the housing market, that means that your problem with solving the problem in real estate will just go on for that much longer. So this is really the epitome of the problem in China is, as we were talking earlier, you have a very dynamic modern sector, produces products that most of the world would kill for at a price that they find incredible. But actually in China, this is only about 12-15% of the economy. 85 to 90% of the economy is not like that at all, and is suffering the consequences of misallocation of capital, low productivity, and of course the real estate crisis, because it's not just the debts which have piled up in the sector, but of course it's the wealth effect on Chinese citizens. So depending on how far house prices and apartment prices drop, obviously that will determine how damaging the wealth effect on consumption is likely to prove to be. It's already proven to be quite significant.
You mentioned earlier the possibility of tax cuts and increasing salaries as ways of boosting private consumption. Is it the Chinese government's view that they cannot afford measures like these because of the amount they're investing in innovation, or why have those changes not been made?
Yeah. This is quite a good question and very complicated because it's all really about the freedom of maneuver that the government has to fine-tune its budgetary policy. Bear in mind that with monetary policy, there's not much that China can actually do. Interest rates are already very low. Credit growth is has been anemic, really. But not because it's because interest rates are too high, but because nobody or not enough companies that should want to expand actually want the credit, because business conditions are very, very tough for many of them. So the issue really is, what can the government do with its budgetary policy? It runs a budget deficit officially measured at around 8 to 9% of GDP. It's actually probably much bigger than that when you count off-budget items and include local governments and so on. And the finance minister himself has actually gone on record in People's Daily in an article a couple of weeks ago, in which he's sort of arguing about how the government needs to be very careful about how it allocates expenditures within the fiscal space. And it's also true at the same time that the only way the government can meet its growth target of, about 5%, which we'll see probably set for next year as well, the only way that happens is by regular priming of the economy through borrowing to stimulate, public works and infrastructure programs and so on. And so the government, again, is basically trying to do a couple of things simultaneously, which are potentially in conflict. It wants to curb the uber use of budgetary policy, shall we say, because they don't really want more liabilities to continue to pile up in local governments. They don't want to use their own balance sheet, which is actually in reasonably good shape, for political reasons. But they know that they can only hit their growth target if they allow new borrowing to happen, often on uneconomic projects. So, we will have to see, yes, again, I mean, this has been happening really in each year since COVID, but we will have to see yet again in 2026 how the government manages to balance these kind of conflicting objectives.
I'm wondering about the situation for young people in China in particular. How are they feeling about their prospects right now?
Well, we know that youth unemployment has been very elevated. I mean, again, it's not the only country in the world where there's high youth unemployment. Spain has much higher youth unemployment, for example. But obviously, China, prides itself in having, care for its citizens and churning out 12 million graduates a year that it believes you will be obviously the future of the country, et cetera, et cetera. So these things are really important. And the problem in China with youth unemployment is, of course, this is just the 16 to 24-year-old age group for which, we have quite high double-digit rates of unemployment. Part of the reason for that is because more people are going to tertiary education, to university, for example. But some of it is because, many of the people coming out of university are coming out with degrees which can't really be used. There's no requirement for them, no demand, or because their skill sets are not matched properly with what companies want. And we've seen, for example, a lot of people, a surge in people in 2024 and 2025, for example, taking the civil service exam, the Gaokao, because private sector employment conditions are so poor. So along with this, we've also seen quite a big shift in the last several years out of the kind of high pay, high skill occupations in manufacturing and construction into the gig economy, informal economy, no proper labor contracts, et cetera, et cetera. These things really all fall disproportionately on younger people, not just recent graduates and people leaving school, but obviously young adults as well. So the formal unemployment numbers, which are plus or minus 5%, are probably not reflecting accurately the degree of joblessness or underemployment, shall we say, in the Chinese labor force, which is, in a way, not such a big deal in the medium to longer term because with the population declining, maybe there'll be less demand for jobs and robotics are going to take over to some significant degree. Nevertheless, it's still in real time certainly a social problem that the government is faced with.
Yeah, you mentioned the demographic challenge there. I'm just wondering how this will play out in the long term, because if it's this cohort of highly educated young people who aren't getting work at the moment, is it the case that in the perhaps less professional sector there is a shortage? And if so, do you think China would ever change its policy on migration, for example, so that, the retirement crisis can be avoided there?
Well, we never say never, or sometimes we do, I guess. But there are some things where you can be reasonably confident things will never change. And I'm not very optimistic that the policy in China on immigration is going to change a lot. I mean, that said, we used to say the same thing about Japan, and Japan has, in the last 5, 7 years, certainly been a little bit more open to migrant labor coming into the country. It's still pretty small beer. But I think in China's case, I don't think that immigration is likely to be or likely to figure very prominently as a way of alleviating labor shortages or skill shortages. But I guess in the long term it could happen. Certainly doesn't seem very likely now.
What about migration the other way? These highly educated young people who aren't finding opportunities at home, are they leaving?
Well, there's certainly been quite a lot of anecdotal evidence. I'm pretty sure there aren't any official statistics about this, but there's certainly been some anecdotal evidence about companies moving overseas and and their owners or some of their senior executives being reassigned to other countries. For example, as Chinese firms move to places like Singapore or to Malaysia or to other ASEAN countries. Certainly, I mean, one always imagines that the well-heeled and the very kind of wealthy in China never have too much of a problem getting their money out, even though there are quite strict exchange controls for most people and for most firms. But there's a contrasting kind of anecdote to that, which is about people who have been expats, Chinese expats who have been working abroad let's say in the United States, and who feel now that it's time to go back, or they're being encouraged to go back because of deteriorating conditions in terms of immigration and visas and what have you. So it kind of cuts both ways, I suppose, but I'm not sure that anybody really has a good grasp on where the balance lies quantitatively.
Now, final question for you. You mentioned the upcoming annual Central Economic Work Conference earlier, which sets the economic agenda for the year ahead. What are we expecting to come out of that conference?
Well, normally by the time the conference takes place, we've already had, in this particular year, for example, we've had already the fourth plenum with a kind of a little window opening up on the content of the 15th five-year plan. And we've just had just completed, actually, in the first week of December, the Politburo meeting, for which the readout kind of gives a little bit of a flavor about what to expect. And so I think what we will see is, the economic work conference will have a big focus on, it's limited really to 2026. They're not really going to talk very much about sort of grand plans for the next 5 years, because that's the job of the five-year plan when it's unveiled next year. So for next year, most people will be looking for, what is the growth target going to be? Probably something close to this year's 5%. How are they going to finance a bigger budget deficit? So we'll want to know how much bigger the budget deficit will be, and how that's going to be financed in terms of special bond issuance. Whether there is any particular emphasis that the government is going to place on monetary tools, for example, interest rates or reserve requirements on banks, or maybe any hint about the exchange rate. But of course, what the two things that we're mostly going to be focused on really is there anything in the work conference readout that says what the government might do to spur consumption next year? They talk about it a lot, but they still seem rather inclined to the idea that the reason consumption is weak is not because of the weakness of demand, but it's because people don't have enough goods and services to buy. So that's a supply approach to the problem, which is probably not right. And of course, the other thing that we'll be very focused on really is industrial policy. The government will talk about new productive forces, which is really about all, pharmaceuticals and AI and climate change mitigation, electric vehicles, batteries, biopharma, biotech, for example. And so all of these things, the government is spending a lot of money on. And so we'll want to know really how the priorities stack up really for next year between these objectives.
All right, George Magnus, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.